Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, first of all, thank you for having all of us here, the Romanian delegation. It's not for the first time that I'm here in this important institution at ICD Berlin. As Mr. Donfried already mentioned, we have back a rather long tradition of developing some programs, especially with the University of Bucharest, in the field of the social sciences and the humanities. Some MA programs and also a PhD program together with the University of Bucharest. And one of the main reasons for being this weekend in Berlin, together with my colleagues from the University of Bucharest, Professor Vlad Nistor, who is also a member of the Romanian Parliament and a historian, Professor Daniela Zaharia, who gave, I guess, also some of you some lectures this week. She's a historian as well, a history of art. Dean Romulus Brâncoveanu, professor in the Faculty of Philosophy, and also Professor Dan Oancea, who is the director, the head of the Department of Public Law at the University of Bucharest. We already had some discussions this morning about how we could improve and how we could expand and develop what we've already got in terms of cooperation, institutional cooperations, and I'm really looking forward and I'm hoping to devise for you, the students, some better programs in the field of law, in the field of history, the field of sociology, globalization, and some other important fields which are of interest today. Mr. Donfried mentioned that I'm coming from logic and philosophy, so for the time that I have for my intervention for the lecture today, I'm going to talk about a topic which, of course, is of very wide interest today. Not only in Europe, I'd say it's of interest throughout the world. It's the topic of toleration. And basically, I'm going to give you two strong arguments coming from some quarters, from some fields of contemporary philosophy, in favor of why human beings, of why social actors and institutions should act in a tolerant way. So just to give you a rough outline of my whole paper, I'm going to examine some presuppositions of toleration and pluralism, and I'm going to explore two models in a very, very short and cogent way, which is a deontological model and a consequentialist model, which could support the view that rational agents should act in a tolerant way. This is part of a larger working project, but the paper that I am going to present to you, part of the paper that I am going to present to you today, is already in print. It's going to be published very soon, by the end of this year, in an international journal which is called Frontiers in Philosophy, which is published in China, so I expect to have a very large readership. I mean, if we mean that in China we have over 1 billion people, I don't know, even if 1/10 of the population of China will read the paper, then I'm going to have a very large readership. Okay, just kidding. So let me just start with some introductory remarks about those two justificatory models of toleration. It is very likely that the most difficult task of moral and political philosophy has always been that of assessing comprehensive views that contradict each other, not so much as concerns the interests expressed by individuals, but as regards what is considered to be of genuine value. If individuals do not agree about what constitutes a good and valuable life, then they would probably end up having dramatic conflicts, even if their actions are motivated by honest, altruistic attitudes. Our deep beliefs about what is good and valuable for the life of all individuals in our own community will make us to use the mechanism of the state in order to achieve the desiderata and the ideals that we share, not only for our own sake, but also for those who happen not to share the same view on the values and meaningfulness of a good life. Of course, those who disagree with us will try to make use of the institutions of the state in the very same way in order to promote and support their own values and ideals. Unfortunately, as we know too well from history, deep disagreements concerning values can turn into very traumatic conflicts which surpass mere conflicts of interest. Now, some of our value disagreements can be resolved through political mechanisms triggered by public debates concerning the goals of our actions, debates which aim at giving strong support for the policies which promote those goals. However, some other deeper disagreements cannot have conventional political solutions. Here we can include deep religious differences and also certain philosophical beliefs concerning the value and the ultimate meaning of life. But when the regular political mechanisms for acquiring social and political stability fail to produce desired outcomes, is there a more subtle mechanism that could keep disagreements within reasonable and non-controversial bounds? In such cases, people are supposed to learn to live in a rational way amidst differences, disagreements, and profound alterity by refraining from using the coercive mechanism of the state with the aim in view of not placing unreasonable limits upon the freedom and rights of those people who share values that happen not to be admissible by the dominant group in that society. Put simply, what people need in such circumstances is toleration. Roughly, the whole spectrum of the concept of toleration unfolds against the background of a pair of presuppositions, namely the discriminating identification of the other, together with the decision to recognize and accept this difference through an active intercultural persuasive dialogue. But why, after all, are we supposed to act in a tolerant manner in a world that is far from perfect morally, deontically, and political state? What conceptual and logical connection operates between moral legitimacy and toleration and between moral illegitimacy and lack of toleration, respectively? If we go beyond the prima facie attractive moral position that urges us to be tolerant and embrace pluralism, then we have to acknowledge that both the conceptual analysis of deep cultural differences and the cultural and political practice of toleration lead us into a sort of paradox. For as the contemporary American philosopher Thomas Nagel very aptly puts it, and I quote, "Liberalism asks that citizens accept a certain restraint in calling on the power of the state to enforce some of their most deeply held convictions against others who do not accept them, and holds that the legitimate exercise of political power must be justified on more restricted grounds, grounds which belong in some sense to a common or public domain," end of quote. Now, this is where paradox strikes and mystifies common sense. For why should such a limitation placed upon justification be the standard form of grounding political legitimacy? After all, for everyone who does not accept that relativism is the most attractive game in town nowadays, the arguments against this limitation imposed upon the justificatory basis of political decisions could appear very convincing and as honest as possible. And one could very well raise the following questions in a very proper way, as Tom Nagel himself does, in order to give the best chance to argumentation in favor of liberal toleration. And I am quoting again from Nagel. "Why should I care what others with whom I disagree think about the grounds on which state power is exercised? Why shouldn't I care what others, why shouldn't I discount their rejection if it is based on religious or moral or cultural values that I believe to be mistaken? Isn't that being too impartial, giving too much authority to those whose values conflict with mine, betraying my own values, in fact? If I believe something, I believe it to be true, yet here I am asked to refrain from acting on that belief in deference to beliefs I think are false. It is unclear what possible moral motivation I could have for doing that. impartiality among persons is one thing, but impartiality among conceptions of the good is quite another. True justice ought to consist of giving everyone the best possible chance of salvation, for example, or of a good life. In other words, we have to start from the values that we ourselves accept in deciding how state power may legitimately be used. End of quotation. So the issue is, why, after all, are we then supposed to be tolerant? Roughly speaking, we can give two answers that lead to two justificatory models for the virtue of toleration. One is deontological or normative, and the other is consequentialist. Let us examine briefly in turn. The deontological model. A full grasp of the power of this deontological concept is facilitated by thinking counterfactually. Thus, to think in a strong deontological sense that any value or any moral norm whatsoever should be followed in our actions means that we are committing ourselves to those norms, even in those contrary to fact situations in which, if we acted according to them, we would be in a worse off situation compared with the actual state in which we are than we would be if we were not to have acted in accordance with them. From whence does this strong moral necessity to be tolerant of those who are different from us in a very profound and maybe non-reconcilable way follow? First, it is worth emphasizing that the background against which we place this strong moral constraint of toleration consists in a deep asymmetrical relation between those who tolerate and those who are tolerated. But then again, the same relation, if looked at from a different angle, has a tendency to become symmetrical, which is nowadays one of the main sources of the contemporary crisis of the concept of toleration. A short explanation will help us here. Toleration is required by the logic of communitarian life when there are at least two groups positioned asymmetrically with regard to the normative center of political and epistemic power. In order to comply with the requirements of toleration, the group which controls power in this asymmetrical relation should accept the need to restrain its coercive means, which may very well be rooted in the exercise of its political power, and to build, in an alternative way, strong argumentative strategies that are persuasive and rational, maybe even compelling. We get thus to the key term to the understanding of the deontological concept of toleration, and this term is reason. We can be tolerant in the name of reason, establishing that everybody is entitled to have his or her own opinion, and that the principle of this right is rationality. But we can also be tolerant in the name of our various failures in acting rationally, recognizing that we do not have access to the absolute universal truth, and therefore to the ultimate certainty, and thus our claim to be always right has no grounds. So what is implied here are two principles whose meaningfulness is crucial for a profound understanding of important philosophical principles that recur in many quarters of contemporary systematic philosophy, such as philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, epistemology, and ethics. So what I mean here is the principle of charity and the principle of epistemic fallibilism. So let me now take them in turn and explain very briefly what it is all about. Toleration and charity. If we closely follow the principle of charity, we will see right away how the idea of toleration is essentially contained in our common mental and moral attitudes. And to make this clear, it is worth pointing to the highly influential remarks that the American contemporary philosopher Donald Davidson made on this subject in the context of his seminal discussion in the area of philosophy of mind and philosophy of action. The stance that Davidson defends with regard to the mind-body relation is called the thesis of anomalous monism. Roughly, the view that there cannot be any psychophysical causal laws which connect mental phenomena with physical phenomena. One of the crucial premises of this conception is that the practice of attributing intentional stances to individuals, mental states such as beliefs or wishes is governed by principles of rationality, while the physical realm is not subject to such constraints. Hence, as Davidson very aptly puts it, the principle of rationality and coherence has no echo whatsoever, the phrase belongs to Davidson, in the physical theory, which makes impossible any causal connection between mental phenomena and physical phenomena. Those principles of rationality warrant that the total set of intentional states that we attribute to a subject and through which one can interpret and predict her actions under normal circumstances will be as coherent and as rational as possible. Of course, this does not mean that we will make the unrealistic and actually false presupposition that those individuals whose utterances and actions are the object for our interpretations could not have false beliefs. Quite the contrary, we know that what gives our beliefs the philosophical bite that makes them theoretically interesting is the fact that they could be, and some of them actually are, false. The principles of rationality which govern the attribution of intentional states encapsulate the idea that we can, however, take it as given that most beliefs are correct. And the reason for this is that a belief is identified by its location in a pattern of beliefs. It is this pattern that determines the subject matter of the belief, what the belief is about, as Davidson is saying. What follows from this epistemic duty that we have toward others as interpreters of their utterances and action is that we should be charitable in the interpretation of their intentional states, and that we should restrain ourselves from attributing to them obvious contradictory beliefs, even when the sentences that they utter are incompatible with the beliefs that we share, or even worse, when their sentences have the surface form of a logical contradiction. Consequently, what is required from an interpreter in order for us to accept her interpretation is the development of an account for the meaning of the sentences and actions of the interpreted individual that is as coherent and as rational as possible. And when the interpreter fails to produce such a consistent interpretation, it is very natural to blame the interpreter herself for the interpretative failure and not the interpreted person for holding unacceptable and inconsistent beliefs. To sum up, the principle of charity will be encapsulated within the following thesis. The requirement of rationality and coherence pertains to the very essence of the mind. That is, it is constitutive of the mental in the sense that rationality and coherence make the mind exactly what it is. And if per absurdum there were beliefs that could escape from the constraint of this principle, then those sui generis beliefs could no longer be considered mental states. Where does all of this lead us in relation to our topic? If we properly appreciate the force of Davidson's remarks, we shall be able to understand why the principle of charity occupies a central place in any serious attempt to explain theoretically how it is possible to understand the utterances and action of others in a rational way. Davidson is crystal clear about this, and I am quoting from him. Since charity is not an option, but a condition of having a workable theory, it is meaningless to suggest that we might fall into massive error by endorsing it. Charity is forced on us, whether we like it or not. If we want to understand others, we must count them right in most matters. If we can produce a theory that reconciles charity and the formal conditions for a theory, we have done all that could be done to ensure communication. Nothing more is possible and nothing more is needed. End of quotation. So summing up the deontological concept of toleration, the Davidsonian principle of charity requires us to prefer theories of interpretation that minimize disagreements. And this is why making an appeal to charity and ipso facto to toleration is somehow inevitable. The current crisis of the concept of toleration erodes this principle of charity, and this is also fed in turn by a very feeble and incomplete application. For, as Davison rightly emphasizes, minimizing disagreements or maximizing agreement is a confused ideal. The aim of interpretation is not agreement, but understanding. End of quotation. Now let me get to the second model, epistemic fallibilism. We also have to be tolerant due to our epistemic fallibility. We have no access whatsoever to absolute truth and certainty in what concerns those matters that are of utmost importance for the moral, religious, and political life of our own communities. Recent debates in metaphysics and ontology about the indeterminacy of translation, the inscrutability of reference, and the underdetermination of theories, fueled mostly by the groundbreaking philosophical work of Quine, have pointed toward some more modest epistemic claims concerning the scope and the limits of empirical knowledge, as well as of empirical certainty. The overall moral is that empirical meaningful knowledge cannot be but fallible, prone to epistemic error and uncertain. But then, since our own moral and political beliefs that we mostly praise and consider honestly, and which may be right on some grounds, may be nevertheless wrong, it is reasonable to acknowledge that those who do not share our fundamental commitments are as epistemically entitled as we are, according to their own justifications, to contrary opinions. Now, according to the consequentialist model, toleration appears as a political tool for alleviating dangerous disagreements or tensions that threaten social order. If what we are looking for is a compact for social and political stability, then it is reasonable to avoid discrimination and to accept things that we would otherwise have strong reasons to dispute and reject. In short, in making a consequentialist calculus, we see that there are far more many reasons for being tolerant than for being fanatic and intolerant. Let me end my short essay and presentation by bringing into discussion a paradox of toleration, something which goes together today with policies of affirmative actions and political correctness. So I shall finish by making a short remark on one of the sources underlying the current pathology of the concept of practice and practice of toleration. This motivates what can be called the paradox of toleration. So the issue is, how should we react when confronted with intolerance? What are the limits of toleration in relation to fanaticism and to what is intolerable? Is it possible, and if so, is it desirable to find a rational grounding for accepting what is otherwise unacceptable? Again, the same philosopher, Thomas Nagel, sees the real problem and danger behind this form of unbounded and unexamined toleration when he speaks about the exaggeration of positive discrimination, better known today as the affirmative action policy. And I will refer for that to a paper in a book which was published many years ago in 1979 by Thomas Nagel. The title of the book is Mortal Questions. Actually, I'm having here more titles in the references, and for those of you who are interested in the literature, I can give you the list of books and articles. So what is all this about? Toleration plays, as it were, the role of the middle term between freedom of speech and opinion, since according to John Stuart Mill, toleration is a necessary product of liberty, and political equality, since according to John Rawls, toleration is logically correlated to equality. It is a real challenge then to keep a proper dynamic equilibrium between individual and social justice on the one hand, and freedom of speech and opinion on the other hand. And basically the same kind of problem will occur when we look for equilibria between norms and whatever deviates from norms, or between rules and exceptions. The current tendency is to focus upon, sometimes even to overemphasize, the value of equality. However, what the political practice of positive discrimination shows, especially when one abuses it, is the difficulty of maintaining a proper balance between equality and liberty. The requirement of equality threatens the requirement of free competition and free choice. For if we push the norms of positive discrimination to the extreme, we end up on a slippery slope, and we will no longer be sure whether or not it is fair that one should always prefer whomever is naturally worse off than whomever is better off, having in view a rather abstract and formal representation of differences where neither one has any obvious moral merit. The legitimate worry here is this: if we generalize this criterion for choice, should we not stick to the same logic? And whenever we have to make a choice, should we not always choose the worse off in order to correct her native lack or opportunity for which, at any rate, she has no moral responsibility whatsoever? Tom Nagel's remarks have the merit of waking us from our moral slumber, as it were, and of making us become aware that if we go down this slippery slope, we end up on the border of a moral utopia. But if we wish to accept something that otherwise is unacceptable, we will have to produce what is impossible in the best case. And if this is what we really wish or want, then we see that we are likely to end up where the whole story for toleration could start in a kind of utopia. However, toleration has no real moral and political point or merit in a utopia, since by definition a utopia is a maximal state where all the norms are actually accepted and followed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dear Honorable Minister, thank you very much. Yes, works. Thank you very much for your so interesting speech. And now I would like to open the stage for your questions and comments, please. Let me to open our session of questions and answer comments also, of course, with brief questions. A brief question regarding the. Actually, I would like to ask you for what is the official position of the Romanian government as a representative of the Romanian government regarding the last discussion that actually yesterday and today are taking place in the European Council, again regarding, so this is a little bit, but again in a connection with your speech of so how the tolerance cannot be so well understood. I would like to ask you again, Romania and Bulgaria in regards with the economic treaty that is going to be signed between European Union and Canada, for example. After that, you know, this is the hottest topic nowadays. Yeah. And again, it's opened the topic also with the participation in Schengen. So what's your comment on that?
First of all, I'm not here on an official delegation as a representative of the government of Romania, so I'm speaking only on my behalf, my own mind, my own opinion. So I know that, I don't know whether or not the situation changed yesterday or today because I was out of the country, but I know that Bulgaria and Romania had different views on that, in the sense that Romania didn't want to sign the treaty unless the Canadian government is eager to accept on a reciprocal basis the waiving of visas. And that was the position that was defended by the Prime Minister of Romania. And it was an exchange of diplomatic letters and dialogue, a discussion between the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania and its counterpart in Canada, and we are waiting for the answer of the Canadian government. But so far the Prime Minister said that unless the Canadians are waiving completely the requirements for visas for the Romanian citizens, Romania is not going to sign the treaty. Again, this is not an official statement.
Of course, of course. Yes, please.
My name is Marco Dragos. I'm intern here at ICD. I would like to have a comment. The President, Iohannis, just announced that from 2017, Canada will raise up the visa for Romanians. Just announced like 1 hour ago. Yes.
Yeah, that's good news.
At Brussels.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really great news. Thank you very much about that.
It's good news, yes.
Yes, absolutely. It's same by the
So
way.
the strategy worked, after all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's absolutely same for Bulgaria. I think they agree for May 2017. Yes, that's at least part of the visa will be. Okay, thank you. Welcome for comments and questions.
So I was a little bit confused with part of your speech, and so if you could just clarify. You said something about or you posed a question and then I lost the thread. Why should we tolerate people with whose information is based on their religion or values that we do not agree with?
Right.
So I didn't really understand your response.
Okay, let me just go over them briefly. There are mainly two responses. The presupposition of both responses is that toleration is more like an attitude than a theory. So is our attitude towards the others in what concerns their individuality, their positions, their beliefs, and especially those beliefs that are very profound, like religious beliefs. We do not speak about, usually we do not speak about the need of being tolerant if people disagree about physics, for instance. We have two physicists who disagree about some fundamental theories about nature. We just say they have different views and let's see how things are developing and we'll see what theory will be the best theory at the end of the day. We speak about the need, the real need of toleration when deep, profound, and non-negotiable differences surfaces in what concerns religion, politics, and now and then some philosophical values, but especially religion. And in the tradition, in the modernity in Europe, actually toleration was for the first time brought up as an important issue just as a remedy for religious wars. There is a famous paper by John Locke about toleration. So the whole issue actually was put forward by philosophers, and philosophers who actually had political views and visions in what concerns very profound, very deep, and very explosive disagreements between people. Because I would say it's better off to stay alive with some enemies in front of us than to be dead, all of us. So that's basic fact. I mean, if we do not agree to that and we praise more, death than life, then there is no use to discuss with those people because actually they are annihilating the basic principle of the discussion. Now, those two arguments that I developed are coming from the idea that by and large, human beings are rational in the sense that they can state in a very clear manner what their goals are, and then they can choose some instruments in order to achieve those goals. So the connection between stating a goal and then finding out what are the best options in order to achieve the goal could be somehow put under the umbrella of bounded rationalism. I do not speak about rationalism as an, historical value. I speak about rationalism of the daily life that we have. So it's a correspondence between goals and means. So one model and one argument is the following. Just because we are rational in that way, we have to be tolerant. Because in order to understand the others, and by the others I mean the others who are very different from us, we have to start from the assumptions that the others are rational in their own ways, as we are rational in our own ways. And the opinions that we attribute to others, beliefs, intentions, volitions, and so on and so forth, are based on the fact that those mental states, as philosophers are calling them, are needed in order to achieve our goals. We achieve our goals based on our beliefs, on our intentions, on our will. So when we attribute to the others those mental states, we have to make the assumptions that those people are as rational as we are, except for the contents of our wishes, okay? And in general, the contents of our wishes is very different. But when the contents are profoundly different, the issue of toleration is actually surfacing. The other model is a consequentialist model. Why should we be tolerant? Because we are better off if we act in a tolerant way, by and large, than if we are fanatics, if we act on fanaticism. And this consequentialist model pertains also to the fact that we are rational beings. So if we agree that we are rational by and large, it follows somehow, not logically, but by this kind of philosophical argument and political argument that we should act in a tolerant way and we should strive for a good interpretation of the others, an interpretation which will eventually give us this sort of mutual understanding.
Hi.
Hello.
Is it working? Okay. You discussed that the beginning of tolerance is to understand that the other people whom are different from us is rational in their own way. But when we look at Europe, for instance, when we look at the history of Europe, for instance, colonization, or the difference between Protestants and Catholics, for instance, you don't really, there's a mentality in which the European is better than the other, in a sense. So with such a strong history of believing that we are better than the other, do you really believe that here in Europe, with what's happening today, that tolerance is possible, for instance, with the refugee crisis that's occurring, with immigration problems that are happening?
Whether or not it's possible, I am optimistic about that. Whether or not it's achievable right now, I am not very optimistic. So it's a long process that it's in front of us, and it's a process that we should fight for, because it's worthwhile fighting for this outcome. And the question that you asked is very legitimate and a very good question. From my own perspective, what you are saying and the presupposition of your question is just the fact that there is a failure of rationality, that the history of Europe, of colonialism, of post-colonialism, of this kind of attitude that some nations have toward other nations are showing. It's a failure of rationality. It's not due to the rationality. Because if you understand well the history of becoming rational, then I guess like in, I don't know, like in Hegel, if you read some Hegel, philosophy of history, you'll see that actually that is the end in view that we have for our own history. I mean, becoming more and more rational and being more and more tolerant just because we become more and more rational. And there is an addition to what I said before, I forgot to mention that as well, is this epistemic fallibilism. So we know very well that we may be wrong about many things, and actually historically our species was wrong about many, many things in what science is concerned, in what some other truth is concerned. But we still have this tendency to be very dogmatic about our beliefs which concerns the most fundamental values of our lives. And that's good because in a sense we act on our beliefs. But we have to be tolerant in the sense that we have to leave room for the beliefs of other people who may not share our views, okay? So if we can actually build this kind of trust, and if we can educate this attitude, then, and this altruistic and this tolerant attitude, then we would be better off as a society in general, not only as individuals. Again, I mean, coming back to the main point of your question, it's lack of rationality which is shown in that kind, in that episodes of the history. And it's not due to the fact that we acted in a rational way. It's just because we didn't act in a rational way. Sorry for my voice.
Hello, my name is Maria Virginia. Okay, my question is not exactly on the topic, but it's related a lot with tolerance and acceptance. And I think that tolerance and acceptance should start at home, let's say.
Yeah.
So, you know that lately in Romania they are discussing about same-sex marriage. I want to know what's your position about that, because as you know, the opinions are split between church and other people who are thinking about getting in, accepting the same-sex marriage.
Yeah, the topic is very much debated in Romanian society today. It's a very contentious topic, to say the least. My own position, you asked me, then I'm going to give you very openly my position, is to accept diversities of styles of life in this regard. So it's not for me as an individual to impose on the others my own style of life. I may be or I may be not a heterosexual or a gay person, so that's mainly for my own individual and private life. When it comes to religion, so when it comes to something which is more objective than my own view, my own attitude, and when it comes to an institution, we have to keep in mind the position of the majority, but we have also to teach majority to be tolerant and to accept on moral grounds, maybe not on religious grounds, but there is more to morality than the religious part of morality. So on moral grounds, we could teach, especially young people, because I'm afraid with the other people, the battle is already lost, but to teach the young people to be more open and to be more tolerant with regard to this very important aspect of their own lives.
Thank you. Excuse me, I was a little bit late. Couldn't attend your lecture from the beginning. But my question is, if you're going to, talk about the tolerance, there are two aspects with tolerance. One with the people among themselves, one with the government. I think if we go to the first concept about the people space, that people already decided to have this discourse of civilization. I've been hearing from 1 year there is a topic, discourse about civilization. But if you look to the government policies, there is something different than this discourse about civilization. If you see 50 years back, we had this Allied Countries Association in the world, and they were so effective and very active. But now, if you see the war all over the world, it means that there is no tolerance among the government. This is the government policies that make violences all over the thing.
Yeah, it's merely a comment, and then I take it as it is. There was no question, right? I mean, you didn't imply to ask me something. It was only a comment, sir, right? Did I get you rightly? Yeah, I agree with you that the tendency of real people in real life is to be as humane as they could. I mean, if you look in the media what the Greeks were doing on the islands, right? Helping people who were about to die in the sea, that was the impulse, the good impulse of their own nature. But when it comes to some decisions that governments have to do, or politicians in the name of their nations and of the governments, the issue changes. But I guess maybe you don't share this kind of vision, but the first impulse that we have is to help. Is not to help. If you see, I don't know, a young child who is in big threat, okay, it's like something that you do not reflect too much. You just want to help because you value life, and you value this very important resource that a young boy or girl has. But then when you reflect and you aggregate all the decisions and you make a whole decision on behalf of your nation or the government should do something, things are changing a lot. But it's this kind of interaction that should be in place here between the arguments that, I don't know, philosophers or political thinkers are putting forward and the decision makers, the politicians that is going the right path in front of us and the dynamics of this discussion. By the way, in John Locke's time, his voice was very singular. But now, after 250 years, we are talking in his frame. So what was very revolutionary at that time now is kind of common sense for many of us. So this shows actually the dynamics of history.
So how do you still account for the between the individual and the nations? I understand what you're saying about individuals being more tolerant one of another, but not governments being tolerant. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we make that divide?
Well, if we had the easy answer to that, we wouldn't have the problem any longer. But one of the, I guess, I'm very convinced about that. One of the main tools in order to narrow the gap, because the gap will always be there somehow, but to narrow the gap is education. Actually, I am very convinced about the value of education in what concerns the cultivation of these virtues, which are moral virtues, religious virtues, civic virtues, political virtues. And, well, this very fact that you are here together coming from many parts of the world, right? With very diverse backgrounds. You share some things, there are maybe some other things that you do not share, but still you are a group, a perfectly coherent group. You have your own goals here as a group, as individuals, so it could work, right? And it has been working on a historical scale over the last centuries, and we are better off now. So believe it or not, I mean, we tend actually to overemphasize, just because the media is so strong nowadays, and Facebook and the internet, violence around us. I could refer you to a very recent book by a scholar, Steven Pinker, who is a cognitive psychologist at Harvard University. And contrary to this common belief that we have that the violence is spreading around us and is escalating, he has some good statistics and some very strong arguments to show that in the history, the violence declined. And this book of his, the title of the book is The Better Nature of Our Angels, or something of sort. So just look at that book, at that construction, that argumentation, and the history and the statistic behind the book. And you'll see that we may be, as a species, prone to violence, but actually the violence declined over the history.
Question?
You, in your essay, were talking about toleration, and I would like to ask, as you know, in Romania, it's now a great debate in a school. One little boy, which has ADHD syndrome, is not accepted by his colleagues. I would like to ask you how we can include like tolerance, how we can improve tolerance at like primary level in like primary school. Thank you.
Yeah, actually we should teach more of that sort of stuff, the young students, the young kids, also in kindergarten, not only in school. And to tell you quite frankly, I'm very appalled about what happened in Pitești. You are coming from Romania? Okay. So I'm quite appalled about that because actually I sympathize very much with the parents of that kid. Actually, they are the foster parents of the kid. The kid was adopted. But what that shows is not only a lack of empathy on behalf of the parents and also on behalf of the colleagues of the kid, who were actually sort of used by their parents and the establishment in order to have that stance. But that also shows the fallibility of the system as such, because if we had better schools and better psychological counselors for that kind of stuff, we wouldn't end up in this dramatic situation. What happens now is that kid is that we put a stigma on him. It's a boy, right? Yeah. We put a stigma on him, and now he's, I don't know, maybe 10, I don't know, 9 or 10 years old. And he will grow up with that stigma. So something which is enough bad now for him, his parents, and his group will be more and more unpalatable in the future, because living with that stigma, being rejected by the group, not being loved by the, or accepted at least, by the kids, by the peers, and also by the professors, will add to the problem that the poor boy already has. So that shows failures on many levels, not only on parents or on the schoolmaster or whatever. It shows failure in general in the model of our society back home. And again, I am very appalled about that. But the solution is not very simple, because if you read the newspapers, we'll see that it's a sort of vicious circle, because now the kid became very aggressive. And what he is doing in the group, in the class, is very disruptive for the class. And of course, in a formal group, you should stick to some rules in order for the group to function decently. But it should be a work that should be done together with the parents, with the kid, and not just to, that's not a solution to expel the kid from the school.
Questions and comments? Okay. So, dear Honorable Minister, thank you very much for...
Thank you for your patience and for your questions.
Thank you very much to you that you answered to the question of our dear audience. Dear ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very sincere gratitude to Honorable Minister Mircea Dumitru.